And we're back in my basement dungeon gym, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of this, hopefully, happy hump day very early in the morning here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Well, I apologize for not being as visible as I had been. Life happens. I've been very busy of late. Well, busy by my standards. It's always different, levels of busy. But I have been pretty busy, and don't want to keep repeating the same kinds of episodes. Like, for example, yesterday was 37th anniversary of the release of the John Carpenter sci-fi classic They Live. So under normal circumstances, I would have done an episode on that. But you kind of go back into the library, if you will, and you realize that I already talked about the film a couple of times, and I just didn't want to repeat myself. Sometimes you have overlap. I mean, there are certain actors. I talked about Clint Eastwood, Robert Redford a lot. That's different. But I just want to try to keep every episode where it's at least a little bit distinctive, and maybe, dare I say, some kernels of wisdom or some interesting points that you're not familiar with, where you say, you know what, at least I learned something. He didn't just regurgitate the same material. But this is not going to be a movie episode or a baseball episode, or, a movie might come up, baseball might come up. I just talked about a movie. But this is more of a personal episode. I realized yesterday, as my day kind of came to a close, I've been in this house now for 2 years. That whole crazy business that I went through to get here safely in one piece without blowing the entire deal. It doesn't feel like I've been here 2 years. I moved in the first week of November of 2023. Packed up the house in Huntington, got everything together, and it's hard to believe that it's 2 years. And if we're being honest, I've had a lot of very, very down moments, down days, and existential crises, especially towards the beginning, where I just kept thinking, what am I doing here? Why am I here? Why did I leave Huntington? And then you really start going down rabbit holes. Maybe you shouldn't have left Massapequa. You can drive yourself nuts when you do these things. But, as an older person, I've been able to quiet my brain down, and when I start going down those kind of negative paths, usually I'm able to just ease up on the brakes, which I have been able to do. But you don't reach a point ever where things feel easy or things seem easy. You might have a number of ducks in a row where a certain percentage of your life you say, you know what? I'm doing more things correctly than I ever have before. But even if that is the case, there still might be a bunch of other elements of your existence that you're worrying about. And that's normal, because it's in our nature to never be fully satisfied. It's why we achieve, because we always want to do more, do better, be better, whatever, however you want to phrase it. Not everybody would explain it the same way. So, relatively speaking, 2025, I've had ups and downs just like anyone, but 2025 has been a much better year than 2024. There were huge chunks of 2024 which were just bad. And I did it to myself. I put myself into negative situations from a lot of different angles, and that's on me, But 2025 it was a little bit, if you want to say the word comeback, it was a little bit of a comeback, where I kept questioning, am I capable of doing this? Am I capable of being in a house by myself and supporting a house by myself? And as much as I despaired, I kept telling myself, I think this is just too much for you. You weren't really trained to do this like maybe some of the other people in your family. But occasionally, a little bit of not trial by fire, literally, but a little bit of where you have your back up against a wall, metaphorically. And as a younger person, in situations where my back was even a little bit up against the wall, I would crumble, fall apart, panic, not think things through, not think things through and saying, wait a minute. I'm not in as bad a position as I'm making it out to be. Why am I looking at it this way? I have more options than I appear. Why am I acting as if the world is coming to an end here when it isn't? This is with the calming yourself down and saying, wait a minute, we got to think here. We have 2 eyes, 2 ears, a brain. We can think this through. There are more possibilities here. This is not either this happens or this happens. No. So 2025 saw me taking an extra couple of seconds, not panicking immediately when things invariably go wrong. Things invariably go wrong no matter who you are, where you are, what you're doing. The village of the nice, happy people is a great thought, great idea, where everything is kumbaya 100% of the time in your life, your personal life, your professional life, family life, whatever. And there are going to be stretches where a lot of different things are clicking at the same time. And then there are times where they're not. And always have to try, give yourself a little bit of a break and take as much time before making a decision as you have to. Don't blunder into anything. Don't race into anything. It's very important. And this is something that a couple of years ago, before I got here, I would have explained this the same way, but I wouldn't have been able to put it into practice. And that's the difference. Because I had a lot of wisdom, I had a lot of abilities to tell you stories, but I hadn't actually done it, at least not in this fashion. So 2025 was a year of, I wouldn't say achievement, but it was a year of figuring stuff out. It was a year of exploring different avenues and going down paths that maybe I hadn't pondered. And, from a certain perspective, there will always be a kind of sadness with the fact that my screenwriting career just didn't go the way that I honestly believed. And many people told me, this is what's going to happen. You're going to sell this script. You're going to get that script set up. And, you'll have at least a couple of projects that end up getting produced. And, self-belief, faith, confidence, belief, all of that is important. And I had that. But just having it, unfortunately, it's not enough. Because sometimes it takes a little bit more than that. Whether it's a little extra 2% of talent, whether it's meeting someone at the wrong time versus meeting someone at the right time, whether it's not knowing a particular individual who could have gotten something set up, whatever it is. But, it wasn't in the cards. Being able to flip from that career path is something that I can look back on, and as much as I can't stand it, but I can take some pride in that, because I was stuck on that path. I was so convinced this is what my life was meant to be, because it always felt like, Darth Vader, it is your destiny, or George McFly, it was my density. But it turned out that my path was elsewhere. And, it's not easy to give up on, to say that you give up on your dreams is a bit of a cliche, but it's not easy to switch your process. It's not easy to be in one business for more than 20 years and then just basically go like this. Well, I didn't exactly go like that. There are other things that I did, submitting my work to screenwriting contests and things of that nature, but that proved to pretty much be a waste of time. So what I thought with that was, let's say if you place highly in a contest, or if you win a contest, that people might notice your work and say, well, this is good, maybe we can make a deal with this guy. Because some people have talked about how that does happen, but it didn't happen. So what I ended up doing was I was spending a lot of money just entering screenplays into various contests, and whether or not they were prestigious, you can place highly, but it doesn't make any difference. You still need someone to say, hey, I really like this, and I want to make a deal with you. Having people glad hand you and say, wow, this is an amazing script. Okay. Do we have a deal? What deal? So I don't really do that anymore. It's not that I'm against the idea, but beating your head against a wall or running into a brick wall, life happens. And when you are a homeowner, you have a lot of different things that you're responsible for, different bills to pay every single month. And whatever you have to do to get that done, you do it. Now, this is something, again, intellectually, as a younger person, if I was asked a series of questions that you could ask me today, or I could ask you today, if you're a homeowner, if you're somebody who is just, is renting or wants to be a homeowner and is wondering, do I have enough saved? Have I given myself enough leeway here? Whatever it is, until you've gone through it, until you've gone through a situation where you didn't have somebody behind you to catch you if you fucked up, as for almost my entire life until my late 40s, I had somebody who was standing behind me, metaphorically, but standing behind me nevertheless. If I dropped, if I screwed up, don't worry, Joe, get him next time. I had my dad. He was always there. And I made a lot of stupid mistakes. And he was very supportive. There are people, in his life who thought he was too supportive. But you reach a level, you reach a point where you start to think about the people who are here before you, in my case, my father and his father. And they both figured it out. They figured out different paths for themselves. And Grandpa was a machinist. He thought he was always going to be a machinist, making airplane parts, as he did in the 1930s, 1940s. But he reached a point where he had a different avenue open up to him. Bowling alley business, nightclub business. Well, there are some people that would say, no, wait a minute, how do you do that? How do you go from this is your life and now you're doing something completely different? Well, yeah. He was very clever. He had probably an IQ above 150. He was good at whatever he tried. And that was an incredible opportunity because to him it seemed, well, I'm not going to be working as hard. I'm not going to have hot saws, metal lathes. I'm not going to cripple myself doing this. Working in a bowling alley sounds like a much easier life, and I'll probably make 5 times as much. Bingo, exactly. So in that case, the life path was an easier path and enabled him to own 2 businesses. Now that's getting lucky, but you also had to have the work ethic. And in his case, he had to be a great people person who knew people, and somebody came to him with a deal, an offer, and said, hey, does this sound good? I know a guy who, et cetera, and then you go from there. So he could not have foreseen where his life was going to go if he was asked in his 30s, do you ever think you'll be a business owner? He intellectually understood the question, but he would have probably given you a look like, what do you mean? How would that happen? I'm just a guy working a 9 to 5 here. What do you mean business owner? How would I ever own a business? Just trying to survive, just trying to, put food on the table. And, at the time, my grandmother was also working, and she was working in the kind of job that she was just an hourly employee. She worked in a toy store. You do what you have to do, right? They figured that out 100 years ago, or maybe a little bit less than 100. Yeah, more like 85 years ago. My father was the first one in the family to go to college, and he knew that he wanted to be an accountant from when he was 12 years old. And that was his whole life. He actually did something that most people probably don't, which is that from the time he was in 6th grade, this is what I want to do. And whatever steps he had to take to do it, he followed all the protocols. Okay, you major in this, and then you take this class in this semester and that class in that semester. And then he started working as an accountant when he graduated college when he was 20. And he was still at least semi-active until he was 70 years old. Until he was 70. He worked in accounting for 50 years. He didn't switch midstream. Now, my grandfather, his father, offered him his half of the bowling alley and nightclub business sometime in the 70s when he was getting to retire. And my dad, very respectfully, no, I'm sorry, Dad, but I'm good. I'm good. I'm a CPA, and this is what I'm going to do. No offense. And it did not hurt their relationship. I know, like, if it was a movie, it would be the crack between a father and son, and they would make a whole thing about it. But it wasn't really anything more than my grandfather not thinking for a second that my dad was going to leave accounting to just be a bowling alley proprietor, but he had to ask. Because why wouldn't you ask? Grandpa had a lot of respect for my father, and vice versa. Al, if you want my share of the business, it's yours. We come up to some kind of arrangement, whatever the conversation was, but I don't think they talked for more than 2 minutes. I don't think it was like, oh my God, was my dad really going to do it? So my father was like 35 at the time. He was way closer to the beginning of his accounting career than the end. I wonder if he knew that he was going to work for another 35 years from 1977. I don't know. Maybe he did and maybe he didn't. But those guys were willing to do whatever they had to do, but only if things made sense. And even as young people, they had the ability to project and to see a larger picture. And my dad was really successful. He went about as far in the accounting profession within normal parameters as you can go. Made junior partner when he was 30 or 31, and then full partner, and then became a business owner. He was still in his 30s when he and his two friends broke away from a bigger firm that was were kind of not playing fair. You know, it was one of those where you guys do the lion's share of the work, and we're just going to puff victory cigars. It wasn't really that bad, but they were working too hard relative to how they were being paid. And they had clients who were willing to follow them anywhere. Very important in that kind of a business where you're not providing a service like somebody who owns a bowling alley and a nightclub. You're providing some goods. You might sell them a bowling ball, right? But you're mostly in a service business, and accounting is a service business. It's built on what? It's built on relationships also. It's built on, I'm more comfortable with this person auditing my books. I'm more comfortable with this guy doing the company tax return because I think he knows what he's doing and I'm going to end up paying less. And I want to stay with this guy. I don't need anybody new. I'll stay with him. That's how you do it, right? Interpersonal relationships, a feeling of family and friendship, even if you're not even close to really being friends with somebody. But my grandfather was the kind of person, they called him Uncle Nat. You know, he always looked older than he was. Again, growing up during the Depression and having a horrific childhood, it probably aged him. He still made it to 96. But you look at pictures of him when he's in his 50s, and I gotta say, he looks, to my eyes, significantly older than I do, at the same kind of, you know, geez, I'm the same age as Grandpa here. Oof, that's rough. But a different life, a more difficult existence. But he was willing to do whatever. And, you know, the irony with my grandfather is that he went upwards. He went into a business where he was able to make more money for working nowhere near as hard. Although he did work 6 days a week. But he was choosing, he was making his schedule. And if he got sick, you know, it's a cliche to say that you can't afford to get sick under certain circumstances. And it's not just 2025. I remember people in the 80s and 90s talking about this. Like, this is not anything new, where you're so focused on paycheck to paycheck that you feel like you can never do anything other than roll the rock up the hill. And then at the beginning of the next day, the rock is back at the bottom of the hill. And Grandpa was able to do something where he didn't have that much pressure on him. He had normal day-to-day pressure. But if he was asked, and I asked him this question, and if anybody had asked this question, what's the worst thing about owning a bowling alley? And what's the worst thing about, you know, kind of helping his partner run the nightclub? Grandpa took care of the bowling alley part, and Harold took care of the nightclub part. And Grandpa would always say the same thing. Parents asking me if their kids had to wear bowling shoes. Now that doesn't seem so terrible. And I said, that's the worst thing about being a business owner in that business? That's it? A parent saying, hey Nat, my son is 3, does he have to wear bowling shoes? That doesn't sound that bad, Grandpa, no offense. And Grandpa, I remember, looked me dead in the eye. He said, Junior, you try listening to that at least 50 times every single day. And then you get back to me. And I kept waiting for him to indicate that he was kidding, but he wasn't kidding. He heard that question dozens of times a day for 20 years. And probably after the first month, there was a part of him that said, you know what? No, thank you. I'm going to go back to making airplane parts. Fuck this. And this fucking question that I keep getting asked. But he toughed it out. He figured out how to quiet his brain down on that one. Because by the end of his career, every time someone asked, he had figured out a way to chuckle. Right? Humor. Use humor even in situations that you don't really find funny. So I have not found humor in where I thought my life was. the projects I was hired for, which fell apart. It's just, I don't need to go into it. You've seen me and heard me talk about this previously. But there is something to be said for at least fulfilling something, doing something to kind of not justify your existence, but that you get it, that complaining about circumstances, there might be valid complaints, but you have to pivot. And you need to be able to adjust your thinking and moderate your expectations. And the fact that I still get to do the podcast, that I get to share my, hopefully, little bits of wisdom and humor, and maybe if it's a movie episode or a baseball episode, some bits of history that you didn't even think were possible. And is this real? And then you Google and it's, son of a bitch, it was real. I thought the guy was just fucking with me. So being able to keep myself afloat without anybody waiting to grab me when I fall, there's something to be said for that. There is a version of my life where I sell a screenplay, or one of the projects that I had, that I was involved with actually got made. Maybe Elijah Wood was never offered Lord of the Rings, and he did, the Brooklyn Dodgers screenplay where he would have been the lead character in that one. But that doesn't mean that 25 years later, because that was going to go when I was in my mid-20s, it doesn't mean that 25 years later, I'm living the life of Riley. Maybe my life would have gone dead end. I would have made more money then, sure, but maybe I would have squandered it. Maybe I would have made dumb investments, and it would have ended up, I'm not signing up to go back and let's reboot the Matrix and let's try this again. I think that I did what I was supposed to do for as long as I could. I went as far as I could in that business, and I had to do something else. And, we all have regrets. Yeah, regrets, we've had a few. We all have regrets, but it's a question of what do you do with that? Mr. Rogers used to say, what do you do with the mad you feel? But what do you do with regrets? Well, you try to turn it around. You try to do something productive, constructive, not just from the financial perspective, but in my case, from the creative perspective. And, there were people for a number of years that were telling me, oh, you should totally do a podcast. You have all this stuff, all this movie knowledge, you would probably be good at it. But it wasn't until my late friend Kenny invited me onto his podcast in the summer of 2023, before I got here, that I really gave it serious thought. And he and I clicked, and before I knew it, I was his co-host, and then we started recording, a couple of times a week. And that's really how I got started with this. So the fact that I do have a creative outlet, it means something. And I enjoy doing this. And, there were stretches I was recording 5 or 6 new episodes in a 1-week stretch. But, I didn't want to be constantly, metaphorically speaking, under the gun. I didn't want to always feel like I had enormous amounts of pressure, got to make this amount of money this week. Nobody likes that. Don't get me wrong. Nobody likes that. And I understand that a lot of people, that's their life. But I saw a way to not have that, to not be under the metaphorical gun all the time. And even with something like not following what you feel is your first best destiny, you still reach a point where you say, okay, I can do it this way instead of that way. I don't have to put myself in such of a bind all the time. And I'm able to, have a number of hours where I'm not doing anything, even on a so-called work day. And reaching that point where you can actually exhale. Because when I was in the movie business, which was, as I said, it's more of like the outer edges. I didn't move away. I didn't live in Hollywood. I was in Huntington. I was in Woodbury. Whatever the specifics were. If you asked me where was I in what year, I could tell you exactly what I was up to. But I was under incredible amounts of pressure, not financial, but I was under pressure in every other angle, getting phone calls from people telling me what was wrong with my script and spending 2 weeks on another draft and then resubmitting, and another 4 different people telling me, now what's really wrong with your script? And it was lather, rinse, repeat. This was years of my life having people tell me vociferously and sometimes using very colorful language what was wrong with this script, what's wrong with that script. Here's how you fix it. And then you do exactly what these alleged geniuses say, and another 4 people say, you know, I liked it before you started monkeying with it a year ago. Go fuck yourself. But that's the downside of that business. One of the downsides, I should say, which is when you have creative literature and people are trying to envision, could this be a movie? You're going to get a lot of discrepancy in terms of, well, we think the first half of the story is a lot better than the second, and then person 2 said, you know, we think the second half of the story is a lot better than the first if you could just figure out how to fix the first half. And you say, well, that's the exact opposite of what 2 other people said. You reach a point where you can't deal with the stress. If you don't see a pathway where you're going to start making money soon in that business, you got to do something else. That doesn't mean give up on your dreams permanently, but it means sometimes you just have to be able to earn a living. You got to be able to earn a living. And, you know, there are plenty of writers who have sold screenplays who made a lot of money, but eventually, you know, unless you get $3 million in one shot and you understand how to budget it and all that, you're still going to have to do something else. There's always going to be the something else. And I was petrified about the something else because for 2 decades of my life, I believed the old, you know, the John Lennon quote, which is something to the effect of, well, life happens when you're busy making other plans. But the other saying is, what you're doing instead of your real job, that is your real job. And that is something that I couldn't handle and couldn't deal with. Because I always felt, even if I took a part-time job, a temporary job, while I continued chasing dreams of glory, that I was admitting defeat. Well, I admit defeat. I have admitted it. Going back to 2019, I went as far as I could go. And I just couldn't justify going any further. There wasn't any reason to. The only reason was to just not accept the reality of the situation. You did the best you could. It wasn't in the cards. You need to rethink your life here. You need to do something else. Still wasn't under that much pressure. In fact, financially, I was really not under any pressure. If we rewind the clock 6 years to October of 2019, I think it was actually September where I quit. But it is important to always be mindful. Give yourself a break, but be open, not only be open to new experiences, but be open to different paths. Because something that you aren't necessarily trained to do, you might end up doing that. You might have an opportunity to do that. Younger me would have rejected it out of hand. But you reach a point where there really aren't that many people who can help you if you fuck up. You reach that point where you can rely on yourself. You need to actualize it. You need to, as much as possible, grab the bull by the horns. Take control of your own life. All of these cliches, they're cliches for a reason, because there is a lot of truth to them. And I can pat myself on the back for having had a better year to this point in 2025 than I did in 2024, or 2023 for that matter, because 2023 started spectacularly well and then just gradually went downhill and then it kept going. It just kept going downhill, and it didn't seem that there was going to be any way to stop the Rolling Stone gathering no moss. Rolling Stone gathered a lot of moss, and 2023 became a shit show, and it was just 11th hour miracles that things didn't get even worse than they were. So this is what I've been thinking about. 2 years in this house, and for all of the times that, you know, I might get down on myself, you might get down on yourself, you need to celebrate the small victories. You need to celebrate those moments where you feel as if you have done proud the people who were here before you. And I feel as if, I'll never be my father, I'll never be my grandfather, but I feel like if somewhere they're watching my 2025, they're saying, you know what? The kid figured out a lot of stuff that we didn't think that he was ever going to get. But he figured it out. He's doing the best that he can. And he's not killing himself. He's not working that hard. He figured a balance where he gets to do the creative stuff that he needs just for, between the years. But the nuts and bolts of earning a living, he's doing okay. You know, and I can hear my grandfather, Nathan Cohen, who's been gone more than 15 years, always called me Junior. And he always called my father Al. Most people either call him Alan or in my case just call him Dad. So you know what, Al? That kid of yours, he's doing okay. He's doing okay. And I believe that my dad would agree with him. You know, my grandpa, I think, had more faith in me than my father did, if I'm allowed to say that. My dad, though, was much more of a sarcastic, kind of pessimistic personality. He was a Yankee fan, you know, and as great as the Yankees were, winning all those World Series, he was always expecting to lose. So my dad would be somebody who had that kind of pessimism. He's not going to do it. Forget it, Dad. He's not going to be able to figure it out. But I do believe that my dad would be surprised in a good way. And, yeah. We got a little bit less than 2 months in 2025, and we'll just have to see how the rest of this year goes. But I am certainly in a better frame of mind. I'm not having any more existential crises as I did in the latter portion of 2023 after I got here. Why am I out here? I miss Huntington. What's going on? And, you know, almost waking up in a cold sweat because you start having these awful feelings of displacement. But that's in the past, and I do believe in every sense I am right where I need to be. Yeah, and that's it. Some days are easier than others, and we still struggle. But now when we struggle, we try to figure out ways to move past it. Instead of assuming, well, better call my dad. Maybe he can help. Yeah, maybe he can help, but he's not here. So, got to help yourself. And yeah, I'm not going to do a conventional wrap-up. This is more of a kind of a quieter, more personal type of episode. So I appreciate you joining me. And yeah, I'll be back with a new episode and probably a movie episode real soon. So I hope you have a great Wednesday and get shit done, but be kind to yourself. Peace.